So it's an outsider's view, and it was an outsider. I'm very concerned about context, and here's my context, starting from when I was first interested in electronics and setting up businesses. And that second column is actually the startups that I've been involved in. And in the second column are the important events or activities. And of course, the highlighted bit, 1980, Acorn, and software, hardware, co-design and network programming, that's where I came involved in Mr. Curry's little empire. And I'll explain why I consider it Mr. Curry's little empire in a minute. But as you can see, I think some other people might have said we went off and set up Softmachinery after that. In fact, as a company, Softmachinery was in Cambridge working on a business system for one of the companies, the tour operator, and it was Beach Villas, which was in around the corner from the Market Square. And we were designing them a mini-based booking system, okay? So here's what happened. We needed, for another customer, which was the National Computer Centre, an accounting modem, and we were designing this accounting modem for the NCC, and then we're going to do software metering trials, and we needed the system. We'd identified the 6809 as a suitable processor, and of course Acorn had advertised this crate, and I came in and talked to Chris and said, we want one of these systems and we want the board, thank you very much, and when can we have it? And of course I think you were a bit inundated, or Acorn was a bit inundated. And then I came back in another time and I was chatting to Chris, and he said, do you know about business systems? And I said, well, yeah, because that's what we're building for Beach Villas at the moment. And he said, we've got an accounting system that somebody's writing for our machines. Now, my view of what Acorn was doing with their own systems and Chris's probably diverges at this point. Up to then, you might have used your own systems, but when it came to business systems, you probably needed, big disks and fairly big meeting machines that would cope with lots of terminals, because if you were going to grow, that's what you would need. And I was a bit bemused, but then of course I said, yeah, okay, I'll have a look at the system for you. And I was horrified. I don't know who it was who was writing it. I've got a couple of names probably sitting down here, and somebody knows it better than I do. But they were at the university. They were deciding they were going to do a B-tree filing system because that's probably what they would like to do. And of course, what happened then was, because I had to try and explain to Chris, Herman was off doing trading on chips. So he's doing arbitrage, which is a technique whereby you say you're going to buy the complete output from a manufacturer of their chips, and then when they're actually coming on stream, you start selling them off to other people at a different price, i.e. profit. So Herman was enjoying his little business manipulations. So Chris and I used to spend a lot of time trying to talk about the sort of detail, or the unpleasant, boring bits of running a business. And then one day, and he used to invite me to stay, but I think that was probably because we'd go for a pint after work, and then he'd get fairly lubricated and we'd drive up to his place. He said, yeah, come and stay with me. So we crashed out of his house quite a lot. And then one day he came and said to me, those bastards, what's it? Who are the company? The other ones. That he thought they'd got the BBC Micro contract, and Newbury Labs, and he was really angry. Obviously, we all know he could get extremely angry. And I said, well, I think I know what the BBC actually do want. And he said, what? As he used to do in his quizzical way. And I said, they want teletext because they want to deliver telesoftware. And he said, what's that? And I said, I'll write you a page for you. And so I did that and talked about Prestel and telesoftware and video text or teletext telesoftware. And as you know, they won the contract. So it got taken from Newbury Labs and Acorn won it. So for some reason, and I used to go in quite a lot to try and sort out this damn B3 filing system, which was going to do all their accounts on it. And someone found out that I was actually a hardware engineer. So if you go back one bit, yes, they are. See all of that on the right-hand column, quite a bit of electronics and assembly language. So anyway, it's somebody, I don't know how it got that I ended up designing the teletext decoder, and I made a right balls up of it, as somebody else pointed out. For ages, we never noticed that I'd wired up the pins on a shift register the wrong way round, so we were inverting all the bits of the bytes, and that was dreadful. We moved us out of Foray Market Hill and into French's farm. Okay, but then at this point it all diverges because we started doing the modem drivers, and that was a network-based modem driver sat on top of the Ethernet. And then Softmachinery went away. We started designing modems, and then we wrote the GNOME at Home, which was a distributed videotext system. And I believe that we gave up on Acorn about 1986. We had other things to do. And I think we still got domain name, but we just went our different ways. I mean, it was only a partnership of hardware engineers, hardware and software engineers. So that was our life in Acorn, okay? And you've seen that picture. And I'm quite happy to talk about hardware designs. Here's an outline of the teletext decoder. And it was extremely simple because what I was trying to do was to take advantage of the high-speed functionality of hardware, but then be able to take advantage of the system qualities of teletext transmission, which meant that I had a whole frame with which to be able to use the 6502 to grab the data out of the memory that had been captured during the line flyback. And so the decoder software was very simple. And that was effectively it. We had a Hamming decoder. And that thing, the signal quality, if you go back to this bit, we pushed that back into a VariCap tuner, and we could then automatically tune the thing in to make sure that we had the best signal. In other words, we were using data errors on the teletext lines to be able to get the tune done properly. And I think somebody else probably finished that off because I was off doing other stuff. But that was, that's how we managed to get what the Beeb had got as a very complicated bit of hardware down to something that would have been possible in production. We were designing for a ULA, but I think we never did it. Acorn didn't get around to doing that because they didn't have huge volumes. Most people ended up very quickly moving over to Prestel anyway. This is our server. This is actually Softmachinery server. There's a hard disk, but there's a couple of printers and stuff like that. We had a Winchester disk attached to our machines. And at one point, I think we got paid in BBC micros. But this was Softmachinery's philosophy. I mean, I have to look at it from this point of view because I've spent probably an awful lot of the time since Acorn as an architect, sometimes fixing systems for other organizations. But this was the architecture for systems in those days. You'd have a mini computer, you'd have some sort of distribution box, and then you'd have PCs, printers, and more often than not, terminals. So you can have lovely ANSI displays. But our view was that you should have a bus. You could sling your computers onto the bus or the network, and then you would have servers for the printers and the modem servers. And that's how we designed the modem server for Acorn, so that you could actually sling it onto the Ethernet, and that modem would be accessible for any of the devices. The side effect was that we could easily then build the GNOME net, which is what we did. And there's a GNOME net, together with a couple of gnomes. And that was it. We just grabbed a BBC Micro, stuck a modem on the end of it, and stuck it into the network, and we could access it, and we could do page captures and add in things. That was the GNOME at home. He was called at home because he hated going out of his house. He used to stay at home all the time and just write stupid code. And this was Glyn Phillips. Sadly for Acorn, but great for us, we poached him. So Glyn became the 4th hardware software engineer in Softmachinery after Terry, Bob and myself. And he loved it. He designed modems. We designed modems for quite a few people. And that's one of his comments. I think he did an email, and I hope he's not sitting here watching any of this because he might disagree. But I'm sure that's an email that he sent me. That effectively what he realized, he was building complex systems, and what we were working with was hobbyist machines. And so he said, no, it's, I'm going to let other people get on and play with teletext bulletin boards. This is my last slide from the presentation. The reason I've stuck that in is when I was trying to build a couple of diagrams to show architecture and stuff like this, I found this one. It's a template in drawing.net or draw.io, depending on how you access it. And that's what they call an internet architecture, or that's the way that it works at the moment. And as you can see, it's still centralized. Everything is point to point, and it's still wrong. When I worked in French's Farm or whatever it was, because it was a bit basic. I mean, some of us actually slept under our benches when we were there, and of course its facilities were fairly primitive. So we would go to the pub in the evenings, and I seem to remember we used to go to the castle at the Castle Hill, and they had a games machine in there, and it was called Tank Attack, I think. I'm trying to have a look at my notes here. But it was a wireframe. It was very primitive, but you basically, well, I used to get killed all the time because it was, no good. But, oh, it says here Battle Tank at the Castle Pub. But when we parted company with Acorn, Softmachinery had to do an awful lot of communication stuff because we were basically communications. We debugged bridges for the BT and stuff like that. So we needed comms facilities. So the office that we had in Crouch End, we put in a PSS line, okay? Now, the reason why we put that PSS line in was that we could telnet into different systems. But one of our, or two of the people from Softmachinery had studied in Essex University, and they knew Richard Bartle. And Richard Bartle was doing some research in AI, and he decided to build a Dungeons game. They were text-based adventures. The only difference was some of the people in the game were not humans, they were avatars. And so he was basically needing human guinea pigs to be able to try it out. So our PSS line, which cost us a lot of money each year rather, was used almost exclusively for playing Mud for hours and hours and hours on end. I think 3 out of the 4 of us became wizards in Mud. And I think there are some stories out on the internet about Bob falling in love with another wizard. Luckily, I think the stories about that didn't get out too much. It could be quite embarrassing. What was interesting about that was it was the difference between standalone games and network games. And of course, Acorn probably was on the cusp. Nearly a lot of the Acorn soft games were standalone. And in fact, in later career, I would say to people that any piece of software on a mobile device that doesn't communicate is just a game. But to turn it around, what we found with MUD was it was actually a community. What you found was that you would be chattering to people, and it's got nothing to do with the game. You'd wander off into a quiet little corner, or you'd go down into the mines, and until you died of radiation poisoning down there, you'd be talking about all sorts of things because you knew nobody else would come along. And we met a lot of people. So Jeremy San, who started Argonaut, was playing in there. And I think at the time he was a 14-year-old. And it was completely different. That, I think, was incredibly formative. Right, that's my games bit, okay? So now if I go to startups, now hang on, I wanted to show you some screenshots. You can see that. And I've got the second page, which I think is also very interesting. This is Big Bubble, which is a radio station in Whitstable, okay? And you can click on that. As you can see, it was this morning, and it says if you want to play it, it just says, just say this, Alexa, open Big Bubble Radio. So there's no link on there, there's no player, they haven't done anything because they'd assumed that quite a lot of people will have something that will respond to voice. And that, to me, is about to change the way that people play games. You know, that company, apart from using Mode 7 graphics as an artistic thing, they have actually said, you know what, we can have a far more richer experience because we can now use or sit on top of other stuff. Okay, so that's my games out of the way. I'm going to go back to the startups now, and I'll stop this sharing because then I can see all the millions of people that are falling asleep with my talk. Startups. So Acorn was a startup, but if I go back to the slides, I think you'll find Acorn was number 6 in my list. Yes, so I'm a serial failure at startups. There is actually one that's still going, and that's HTEC, or High Technology Electronics Company, and it was bought by GrandNet. There was only 3 of us, and I think I did the S100 display board for them, and they Grand Metropolitan Group bought us, and we started using trading desks for them. But startups are interesting, okay? Because, and at this point I have to get my notes, you think you're going to have a great time. You're going to grow rapidly if you've got a great product. But then someone comes along and says, oh, we need to manage this. And then you start getting the different positions. So you get an org chart. And sadly, at some point, you come into the office one morning and you think, you know what, this is exactly what I was trying to run away from when I got involved in this startup. It's the reason why I've jumped so many times. As I say, 16 of them. And I think at the moment I'm involved in 2. One is an holistic business transformation. And I think, oh, really? I'm a hardware and software engineer. I enjoy doing really technical things, and these people want me to coach and train people. And I'm like, oh, no, thank you very much. The reason why I think startups get destroyed is because the beginning of last century, there was a guy called Taylor, and he described something which was called scientific management. And it was basically the people who work under a manager are numbnuts. They haven't got any decision-making capabilities. And so the managers must actually order and tell them what to do. Now, in an early startup, you've got very few people. Everybody does their own jobs. They also do every other job that they find that they need. And Chris was an extremely good chief engineer because he let people do what they wanted to do because he trusted that they could do the right thing. And it's only when Acorn brought in their gang of 4 managers, and this is the point at which I fell out with Mr. Curry, because I said, that will destroy your company because you're going to lose the contacts between you and your staff, right? And so I think, Chris, you did a Herculean task keeping people together. And I applaud you for what you did. Okay. But I think I've got the notes I've got here. I've got some links, and there is actually a video, a YouTube video of me doing a talk in Warsaw at an Agile conference, and it was called No More Managers. And that's the problem. If you ever get involved in a startup and somebody says, oh, we must have a manager for this, then run a mile, because that's the death knell of the startup. Right. Which next one should we do? Should we do the culture, British company? I like that one. Okay. The Beeb really like playing Kingmaker. They have patronized a pop group. The Beatles would never have become as popular as they did without the radio show that the BBC did with them. And then they started doing video specials, and that was it. They encouraged the publishers, Parlophone, I think it was, to push their records out. So that was great for the BBC. And I think to a certain extent, when they were thinking about computer literacy, they liked the idea of having association with an organisation that was close to an institution of learning, i.e. Cambridge. So that was what they liked. And I remember going to a few meetings with the BBC during and after, and it was a very cultured place. And I can remember in one conversation with some people, they said, how would you like it if creatives provided input for your work? And I thought, oh, so us engineers are not creative? So that's what I thought was good. The British organisations, hang on, I'm just going to, yeah. There's something else. I don't know if any of you have seen the Ready Player One film by Spielberg. And that's got a very skewed history of what happened. And here in Britain, we did do some amazing stuff. And we tried very hard not to be completely overrun by Americans. So Videotex was done in Britain. It was done by an Egyptian, but he became a BT engineer. He lived in Britain and he died in Britain, as far as I'm aware. I'm just checking with my notes. So I've got to make sure. And, you know, Mode 7 was an amazingly efficient display. It allowed us to do much more, and you only need to look at all the crazy games that were done with the Mode 7, just with those small sets, and it allowed, you know, an efficient system. But the Americans looked at it and thought, we don't need that. We've got Hercules boards, haven't we? Okay. And of course, as we discovered with GnomeNet, it was the precursor to the internet. Yeah. We had messaging, we had everything. Moving on. I've got a little bit about personal computers, and it's just that Acorn wasn't earliest. Chris worked for the pirate of industry, Clive, and you know, he tried to get into it with the MK14 and other stuff. I actually had a NASCOM. I built it. Then I got bored with this NASCOM. I gave it to a friend of mine, and then he said he'd found about 15 bent pins underneath the memory chips, but it still worked. So that's that. Well, I don't know, the hardware design and the software design is a little bit esoteric. So I think really the only thing I want to talk about now is the fact that I worked in Westfield College as a lecturer in real-time systems before I came to Acorn. And I had the good fortune to work with well, he became my mentor, a guy called David Hendry, and he was a research fellow at Westfield College, part of University of, no, King's College. So I think he said it was the Institute of Computer Science. And he'd been working on fairly scary sort of designs of systems. And one of them was that basically you had the compiler built into your applications. So you had all the advantages of parsing and text processing and stuff like that. So your apps grew around it. And I found, you know, it was still being used, this same system, in 2004 at Stanford University. And they used to use it, very similar to Forth. Forth used in all sorts of places because it was an extremely powerful way to grow your application, keeping the kernel in there. And it was used, this system was used in rip up and reroute for semiconductor design. So, you know, there are areas of software design that have completely been ignored, and we've been doing procedural programming for far too long, which is why if you go back to my slides and look right at the end, I'm now looking at software generation using machine learning. So it uses the same sorts of techniques as hardware designers that allows them to produce chips with, you know, millions of transistors, but with software. I think that's about it. You might even be able to get away early. So is there any other questions?
So I'm just going to kick things off first of all, because you made reference to the change in management style at Acorn and suggested that that was the reason for its subsequent demise. And I just wanted to sort of ask you about that, and because a lot of successful computer manufacturers and designers failed all around about the same time, and one might say that the reason that Acorn and others failed was that they failed to see sufficiently early the writing on the wall in terms of the majority of business gravitating to one universal standard, the sort of DOS Windows standard, rather than just the change in management style. And I wonder what you thought about that.
Right. I also happen to know Mr. Gates, Bill Gates. He and I communicated before he set up before he set up Microsoft. And in fact, one of my students from Westfield College went over there because I said, well, if you fed up with big computer companies, why don't you go and work with this friend of mine, Bill? And he went and joined Microsoft, and he stayed there, I think, for 13 years, and then he left with 6 million. So perhaps I did the wrong thing. I don't know. Anyway, the thing that kills most organizations is not the homogeneity, but quite the opposite. What happened with Acorn? They were producing products at the beginning that people desperately wanted. They discovered that electronics and software together could do amazing things, like the petrol pump metering and the one-arm bandits and stuff like that. And then, of course, they knew, because of Chris Curry's involvement with Clive, that there were lots of hobbyists who were keen to get their hands on something that could give them some experience of software, because they had started perhaps with electronics. They knew how to wire things up, they knew how to solder things, but they needed to gain experience with software. So there was a pent-up demand, but that homogeneity that you're talking about, I don't think was the problem. I think, yes, having the int20 interfaces, which is what allowed us all to write software for all the PC whole range, all of them, no matter which model of Windows or DOS you had. Yeah, that was good. But the fact is, you make your money by selling something that somebody wants, okay? And I think what went wrong with the computer industry in the 80s was that they did bring in their managers, and a manager's job is risk reduction. And so they would look at the product range and they might say, oh, do we have a market for this? But they wouldn't actually go out and find out if somebody wanted a product, okay? And they knew, as Chris had pointed out, that they had sunk costs in Acorn, which was, we've got engineers, we've got R&D, we've got them all. So for God's sake, let's get them applying to different products. And so even though they would produce a product in America that probably hadn't got an awful lot of market, they were still taking advantage of all these people, okay? And it just went on like that. But eventually they would say, oh no, we can't have this. These are too costly. We must reduce the costs. Have you ever noticed a manager sacking other managers? No, it doesn't happen. They get rid of the engineers, okay? So yeah, as soon as, they used to be called, well, I called them the Gang of Four, and it was four managers, and Chris knows them much more detailed than I do. But yeah, I did say very clearly, they will be the cause of your destruction. And of course, I have to say, I actually did an engineering management apprenticeship with the post office, or later the BT, but I was actually on the postal side. I worked at Dollis Hill. And so I know all the things about management, and I have to say, I look at it and I say, that's just admin. You could get anybody to do the things that most managers do, but you don't get managers being creative. You don't get managers working long hours. As Chris pointed out, there would be people working overnight, but he couldn't do that because he had a family, okay? And so the people that were working long nights were young, enthusiastic, and were desperately hoping to create something magical, which is what they did with the Beeb and with the other devices. But eventually there was no market because things were moving on. I went to Scion after that. I worked on handhelds. You go back to the history thing. I've continually tracked down getting smaller and smaller devices, and yeah, the writing was on the wall as soon as they avoided looking at pocket devices, but trying to say, oh, well, we still need workstations. Yeah.
Okay, so now a very different question, which is actually from Chris Turner. Could you add some more detail about your role and timeline in the teletext adapter development? He says that he knows that you and he kicked it off, but what happened next? He says he can't remember.
Hi, Chris. Yeah, well, I'm amazed that you remember any of it, but then you did have your notebooks, your amazing notebooks. But yeah, that we went to the BBC Research Centre and they had a demo, and they, it's full of chips, and it had, I think it was a SAW filter. There's decoding stuff, and it was all terribly over-engineered. But then you expect that in a research centre. And Herman, he said, oh, we can't make this device. It's going to be far too expensive like this. And I said, well, you've got to, we've got to simplify it. And so I knew that we could do co-design. I knew that the 6502 was a shit hot processor. It was very organized, very efficient. And what we needed to do, and as I say, you had that great big time at the beginning. You had this great big gap between the flyback and the next time. So during that, you grab one line of data, and we could use hardware to do that. And then we'd use the 6502 to grab it out and do the other little bits of processing. Because literally all we do, you look for the MRAC, I think there's a bit of a header on each of the rows of 64 bytes, and it told you what row it was in a page and stuff like that. So you get the software to decide, oh, do I need it, or am I just going to throw it away and ignore it, right? And they weren't making those decisions in their prototypes. They were doing it all in hardware. They were using all these other semi-custom chips. I think they were from Ferranti, I'm not too sure. They might have been Mullard. All these companies have gone now because they were dinosaur, dodo, bloody hardware designers. Sorry. But we did make a simpler one. I built the wire wrap because nobody else would have built it. I mean, it just would have sat around. Chris would have had it escalated up to him at some point, and then he'd have to go and beg, steal or borrow some engineers to make it happen. So I thought, oh, sod it. How difficult can it be? So I built the prototype, and as we know, the bit order was the wrong way round. We thought the steeple in 4A Market Hill was distorting the signal coming to us. That's why it got moved out to French's Mill. And then we found that it was still not affecting it. And then I sorted out the bit order. We had a prototype. And I think at that point, Herman said to me, oh, we're not going to put it in a ULA. We're just going to have discrete semiconductors. So the board was it. And it was probably going to be left to a certain person doing engineering for production, Chris, to finish it off. But it more or less all worked. And as I say, because it wasn't going to go to ULA, there was little point in me being involved anymore. I think I met Johnny Wong a couple of times. In fact, I met him a few times after my time with Acorn. And he'd said that it would be so much better, but every time he tried to talk to Herman, he said, no, we're not going to do it because, you know, it's too low volumes, nobody's interested, and we'll just concentrate on the modem, which we designed anyway.
Can you remember who you handed the design on to, who picked it up after you?
Well, let me see. Who was that store guy in French's Mill?
Colin Priestley?
Possibly. The one who went off to Australia.
I think that's Colin.
Yeah.
He did a bit, did he? Yeah.
Yeah.
I know it ended up in the Silver Building. I think it was in the auspices of the group that was then being run by Simon Rain.
Yeah. Yeah.
You remember Simon?
No, you see, you know, I got, as I say, it was a very peripheral, because I was a contractor coming in, and, you know, with the random way that Chris ran the business, you know, I was there offering to buy a piece of equipment and then got asked, would I sort out their bloody accounting system for them? And then found that I could do hardware. I mean, that hardware design, because it was, you know, ostensibly aimed at semi-custom, and then they decided it was too costly to go to that. It got put on the back burner. And I think their attitude was, we might not even have to make any. I don't know how many you made, and it was tiny numbers.
Yeah, I mean, it might have been 5,000 or something like that.
Yeah,
maybe
possibly.
10. I think as well, of course, the tele software service itself didn't really kick off for a couple of years after that, did it? So
sadly, Softmachinery was writing that front end.
But I mean, there had to be, you know, a population of schools with BBC Micros and educational software. You know, the whole thing had to get going. So I think there was a sort of, shall we say, a protracted development cycle while until the product became a priority.
Yeah, and that's the point, that, you know, we had other things to do. The system creating the pages for the BBC was done by us. Yeah. I mean, you only need to look at all the pages to see it says ... softmac underneath at the bottom right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we even ended up having to debug the bulk uploaders that Prestel were using. Yeah. So we'd moved from the client end to the server side. Yeah. And, you know, I mean, we were having battles. I don't know whether you're aware that there were two telesoftware formats. We knew that CET format was pretty restrictive. Mm-hmm. They were only going to be able to do fairly simple programs, and it was tied to, I think it might have been tied to basic or textual programs. We couldn't send binaries and things like that. Right. So we wanted a revisable telesoftware format, and I think that we were off doing battles with the BBC and with other organisations, Department of Trade and Industry, I think. But yeah,
because it had to be an open standard, didn't it? Because I think the ITV had the opportunity, at least, to broadcast software as well, didn't they?
Yeah, yeah. But they all, as I say, they all came in with their own requirements.
Yeah.
And as soon as people wanted something that could load different images or data chunks, then it became difficult.
Yeah.
But you're right. You know, the hardware got done as far as it needed to. You could demonstrate that you had the capability,
Yeah.
and then you just needed to go away and, you know,
finish it in what became a timely manner, as it were.
Yeah.
So your role was really the proof of concept at the beginning to prove you could do it. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, as you said, we went down to see them in, what's it, Warren? And,
Kingswood Warren.
You know, I was horrified how over-engineered it was. But then, you see, it was a transition. Yeah. A lot of engineers were just hardware engineers, and they had no concept of using software to assist the design.
Yes.
Or to make the design simpler.
Yes, yeah, that's very true. Well, thank you. I just wondered whether there was more to your memory than I remembered, as it were.
You've got to be joking, Chris. I didn't use notebooks.
Pure chance I've got mine. There wouldn't have been a talk without them. Anyway, it's really nice to see you again, Mel, and yeah, I hope you do well.
Thank you. Yes. After many years, I came back to Cambridge, and I worked for Symbian.
Of course. And, you must know Dave Wood very well.
Oh, DW, yeah. And when I arrived in Symbian, because they poached me from Scion, I met him at the first convention, which was 2000. Yeah, we get on very well. We occasionally meet. He has a futurists group in London.
Yes. A few Symbian folks rocked up at ARM as well, but I can't remember which ones were which.
Quite a lot of people from Symbian then jumped to ARM when Symbian was being carved up by Nokia.
Yes.
Previous to them being bought by Microsoft. Because it was a cartel, Symbian. It was there specifically to stop Microsoft getting into the mobile market. And it was quite effective. You know, it has stopped them forever. People have moved on into different things, and in Symbian's case, because it was just completely stopped all in one go, whole rafts of people disappeared off to a different place. So I think 300 people got bought by Accenture, and it became their mobile division, and that was the consulting part of Symbian.
From a Canadian point of view, I lived in Iceland for 5.5 years, and I came across the Beeb for about 10 months. I'm kind of in a room that's surrounded with Beebs and Acorn kit, and I find the history of the UK's computer syndrome. It's an amazing story, and I'm constantly learning. I have been for the last 10 years, learning about all the stuff I missed there. I quite honestly, I see other retro computer clubs that are dealing with old IBM PCs and stuff of that, and frankly, that's dull to me. But the story of the BBC and the master and working up through the Acorns beyond that, it's exciting. I you know, it really is. It's thrilling. I didn't live through it. I lived through having a BBC micro for 10 months, and one day I came across the ability to be able to purchase one online from the eBay monstrosity that it is, but I got it at a decent price compared to what today's prices are like. And the history is fascinating. So what you're bringing to the table for me is an amazing amount of background history that there's no other way I could get. And certainly this time of COVID is actually in many ways a boon to someone that's you know, a 10-hour flight away.
We've reduced the commuting time now. I can get up and walk to my office, but I'm still late each morning. But Chris, as he rightly points out, he's got his notebooks. He kept track of all the brilliant ideas. It's like Sophie was determined that we were going to use the 6502 to prove that it was a better processor than things like the Z80 or the 68,000, I think they were going to try and push onto us. And that was you know, because it was a very simplified architecture, but it could run like crazy. You could crack it up really fast, and so it
Got a bit of
was
pipeline
just,
in it.
you know,
Anything else?
huh?
Pipeline inside. Got a bit of pipelining, hadn't it?
Yes, but also it had very few registers, so it's so much easier
It was
to
almost RISC.
construct stuff.
It was almost RISC.
Yes, yes,
So,
it was.
Ed, this wonderful book here called Digital Retro. I don't know how well you can see this, but this has got a big double-page spread of all the different machines. There's American ones in here too. There's the iPhone. Yep. But what's amazing in this is how many of these machines. Here's one. Look, the Oric, and there's the Dragon I just went past, and look, there's Lisa. But there's the Dragon. There's the Sinclair, Commodore, and there's the Atom, of course, and the Beeves in here, and more Sinclair.
Retro tech, yeah.
Yeah, and right up here somewhere, just then I had my finger in it. Mel, there's your NASCOM.
Yep.
It's just a little bit sad that we aren't actually in Cambridge today, because at this point, or perhaps a little bit earlier, we would be going off to the pub. And hopefully we can all be back in Cambridge, maybe this time next year. We'll have to see.
Well, I should be in a pub in Cambridge tomorrow evening.
Yeah, the difficulty is having a group of 30 or 40 people congregating together from all over the country. But Mel, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for your insights, both into Acorn and indeed other aspects of British technology startups.